Grief is not a storm that passes, but a winter that settles in the bones, freezing everything it touches until even love feels like a threat. England, 1823. The storm that battered the carriage was not merely a disturbance of weather. It felt like a warning from the earth itself. The wind howled through the crags of Cumberland, a wild, untamed sound that rattled the very bones of the hired coach as it struggled up the winding, mud-slicked road. Inside, Clara Hallowell shivered, drawing her thin woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders. The fabric was coarse, scratching against her neck, a constant tactile reminder of how far she had fallen. 3 years ago, she would have been wrapped in cashmere, travelling in a vehicle emblazoned with her father's crest, the Viscount Hallowell. Now she was simply Miss Hallowell, a woman of 26 with calloused hands and a trunk that contained everything she owned in the world. Through the rain-lashed window, the silhouette of Wycliffe Hall emerged from the gloom like a fortress of dark stone, carved directly from the mountain. It was not a welcoming home. It was a monument to power and isolation. Towers pierced the grey sky, and the windows were dark, save for a few faint flickers of candlelight that looked like dying stars trapped in obsidian. Clara pressed her hand against the cold glass. She needed this position. Her funds had dwindled to copper coins, enough for perhaps a week of lodging in a squalid inn, and then nothing. Starvation was a spectre that had walked beside her since her father's suicide, and she had learned to fear it more than she feared the reputed coldness of the Duke of Wycliffe. The carriage lurched to a halt in the courtyard, the horses blowing steam into the frigid air. No footman rushed to open the door. Clara let herself out, stepping immediately into a puddle of freezing sludge that soaked the hem of her grey dress. She grabbed her modest trunk, refusing the driver's half-hearted offer of assistance. She had learned that in this new life, dignity was the only luxury she could afford, and she would not relinquish it by appearing helpless. The great oak doors of the manor opened before she could knock, revealing a cavernous entrance hall dominated by marble and shadows. A severe woman in black bombazine stood waiting, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. This was Mrs. Grapes, the housekeeper, whose face seemed as weathered and unyielding as the landscape outside. "You are late, Miss Hallowell," Mrs. Grapes said, her voice dry as parchment. "His Grace does not tolerate tardiness." "The storm made the roads difficult," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the trembling of her limbs. She lifted her chin, a reflex of breeding she tried to suppress but could never fully erase. "I assure you, I am eager to begin." Mrs. Grapes looked her up and down, her eyes lingering on Clara's fraying cuffs and the plainness of her bonnet. There was skepticism there, but also a hint of pity that Clara found harder to bear than scorn. "Leave your trunk. The footman will take it to the nursery quarters. His Grace is in the library. He wishes to see you immediately." Clara followed the housekeeper through corridors that smelled of beeswax, damp stone, and an underlying scent of abandonment. The house was magnificent, filled with tapestries that would have cost a fortune and vases from the Ming dynasty that sat collecting dust on mahogany tables. Yet, it felt devoid of life. There were no fresh flowers, no laughter, no sound of footsteps other than their own. It was a mausoleum built for the living. When Mrs. Grapes opened the double doors to the library, the scent of sandalwood and old leather washed over Clara, momentarily dizzying her. The room was vast, lined from floor to ceiling with books that could have filled a university. A fire crackled in the hearth, but it did little to dispel the chill in the air. Standing by the window, with his back to her, was Sebastian Vance, the Duke of Wycliffe. Even in stillness, he was imposing. He was tall, his shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the title that terrified half of England. He wore a coat of dark blue superfine wool, tailored to perfection, hugging a frame that spoke of disciplined strength rather than leisure. "Miss Hallowell," he said. His voice was a deep baritone, devoid of warmth, like the tolling of a funeral bell. He did not turn around immediately. "You are the 5th woman to stand in this room in 6 months. I intend to be the last, Your Grace," Clara said softly. He turned then, and Clara felt the breath catch in her throat. He was devastatingly handsome, with features that could have been carved from marble by a master sculptor, sharp cheekbones, a strong, square jaw, and a mouth that looked as though it had forgotten how to smile. but it was his eyes that held her. They were dark blue, the colour of the ocean at midnight, cold and impenetrable. There were no scars on his face, as the village gossip had suggested, only a profound weariness that etched lines around those striking eyes. He walked toward his desk, his movements fluid and predatory. He did not ask her to sit. "Do not make promises you cannot keep." The others said the same. They left in tears, or in a carriage bound for the asylum. He picked up a piece of paper, likely her letter of reference, though he barely glanced at it. "My son Arthur is difficult." That is the polite word society uses. The truth is that he is broken. Clara felt a flare of indignation on behalf of the child she had not yet met. "Broken, Your Grace. He is a child of 6. He is a mute," Sebastian stated flatly, tossing the paper down. "He has not spoken a single word since his mother died 4 years ago. He is prone to fits of violence. He cannot walk properly due to a deformity in his foot. He is a source of constant frustration to himself and everyone around him. I do not pay you to love him, Miss Hallowell. I do not pay you to act as a mother. I pay you to ensure he does not destroy the house or himself. Can you do that?" Clara looked at him, seeing the wall he had built around himself. He spoke of his son as one discusses a bad investment or a crumbling retaining wall. But beneath the cold pragmatism, she sensed a deep, festering wound. He didn't hate the boy. He feared him. He feared the reflection of his own failure. "I can ensure his safety and his education," Clara replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. Her green eyes locked with his dark blue ones. "But I will not treat him like a prisoner in his own home." Sebastian paused, a flicker of surprise passing through his gaze. He was used to sycophants and terrified servants. He was not used to a woman in a ragged grey dress looking at him as if she were his equal. "You have spirit," he murmured, though it sounded more like an accusation than a compliment. "Let us see how long it lasts. Mrs. Grapes will show you to the nursery. You begin immediately." Dismissed, Clara curtsied, a perfect, court-worthy curtsy that she executed before she could stop herself, and turned to leave. As she closed the heavy door, she thought she felt his gaze burning into her back. But when she glanced over her shoulder, he had already returned to his papers, the master of his cold, silent kingdom. The nursery was located in the west wing, the part of the house most battered by the wind. As Clara climbed the narrow servants' stairs, the silence of the lower floors was replaced by a rhythmic, dull, thudding sound. Thump, thump, thump. Mrs. Grapes stopped outside a door at the end of the hall. "He is in one of his moods today," the housekeeper whispered, looking genuinely uneasy. "The last governess, Miss Pringle, tried to force him to recite the alphabet. He bit her hand until it bled." "Thank you, Mrs. Grapes. I can manage from here," Clara said. She waited for the housekeeper to retreat before she took a deep breath, smoothed her skirts, and opened the door. The room was large but dimly lit, the curtains drawn against the storm. Toys lay scattered across the floor like the debris of a battlefield. Wooden soldiers, tin drums, torn picture books. In the centre of the chaos sat a small boy. Arthur Vance looked agonizingly like his father. He had the same raven-black hair, currently messy and overgrown, and the same pale skin. But where the Duke was immense, Arthur was fragile. A small hunched figure radiating tension. He was sitting on the floor, holding a heavy wooden block in his hand. As Clara entered, he didn't look at her. He hurled the block with surprising force against the far wall. Thump! It hit the wallpaper, leaving a dent, and fell to the floor. He picked up another. Clara closed the door softly. She did not speak. She did not use the high-pitched, condescending tone adults often reserved for children. She simply walked into the room, avoiding the scattered toys, and sat down on the floor about 10 feet away from him. The change in his rhythm was immediate. Arthur froze, his hands suspended in the air holding a blue block. He turned his head slowly to look at her. His eyes were wide and dark, filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. He waited for the scolding. He waited for the order to stand up, to clean up, to behave. Clara did nothing. She arranged her skirts around her, picked up a discarded wooden soldier from the floor near her knee, and set it upright. Then she picked up another and placed it beside the first. She was building a line, calm and focused, completely ignoring him. Arthur watched her, confused. Slowly, his hand lowered. He didn't throw the block. He watched as she added a third soldier to her line. The silence in the room shifted. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of the house. It was a companionable, curious silence. Minutes ticked by, marked only by the sound of the rain against the glass and the soft clack of wood against wood as Clara built her formation. She could feel his gaze on her, assessing, judging. She knew that trust was not given. It was earned, and for a child who had been treated as a monster, words were meaningless. Only action mattered. Arthur shifted his weight, and a small whimper of pain escaped his lips. It was quickly stifled, but Clara heard it. She stopped her hand mid-movement, but didn't look at him directly. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw him rub his right leg. He wore heavy trousers, but on his right foot was a thick leather boot, reinforced with iron braces that disappeared up his calf. It looked medieval, a torture device masquerading as medicine. He shifted again, trying to stretch his leg, and his face contorted in a grimace that made him look decades older than 6. Clara turned to him then, moving slowly. "That looks heavy," she said softly. Her voice was low, melodic, not demanding an answer. Arthur stiffened, clutching the block again as a weapon. "I bet it hurts," she continued, keeping her hands visible and open. "My father once had a pair of boots that were too tight. He was in a foul mood for weeks until he threw them into the river." Arthur stared at her. The mention of someone else being in a foul mood seemed to intrigue him. He looked down at his boot, then back at her, his expression guarded. "May I look?" Clara asked. She didn't move closer. She waited. The boy hesitated. He looked at the block in his hand, then at his leg. The pain must have been excruciating, overriding his distrust, because he gave an almost imperceptible nod. Clara moved on her knees, crossing the distance between them slowly. When she reached him, the smell of the room hit her, dust and stale air, but also the scent of lavender soap from the boy's skin. Up close, she saw the dark circles under his eyes. He wasn't just angry. He was exhausted. She reached out and gently touched the leather of the boot. It was stiff, unyielding. "I'm going to unbuckle it just for a moment to let your foot breathe. Is that all right?" Arthur didn't pull away. Clara's fingers, deft and practical, worked the heavy iron buckles. The leather groaned as she loosened the straps. As she pulled the tongue of the boot away from his shin, she gasped. Underneath the expensive leather and the iron brace, the skin was raw. The boot was far too small. The boy had grown as children do, but the appliance had not been adjusted. The iron was digging into the soft flesh of his ankle, creating an angry red welt that was on the verge of blistering and bleeding. The pressure on his twisted foot must have been agonizing with every step, every movement. Sudden hot anger flooded Clara's chest, not at the boy, but at the world that had failed him. The Duke called him violent. The servants called him mad, but he was simply in torture. He was lashing out because he was in constant biting pain, and he had no voice to tell anyone. "Oh, Arthur," she whispered, her heart breaking for him. She looked up into his eyes, and for the first time, she saw the child beneath the trauma. He wasn't a monster. He was a little boy who was hurting. She finished unbuckling the boot and gently eased it off. The relief on his face was instantaneous. His shoulders dropped, and a long, shuddering breath escaped him. He looked at his red, swollen foot, then up at her with an expression of pure wonder. "It's too small," she said firmly, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "It's crushing you." Arthur reached out and touched the red mark on his leg, then looked at Clara. He didn't smile, but the darkness in his eyes receded, replaced by a tentative connection. He pushed the blue block he had been holding toward her. It was a peace offering. Clara took the block and placed it on top of her line of soldiers. "We are not putting that back on," she declared. "Not until it is fixed." She stood up, the grey skirts of her dress rustling. The hunger and fatigue she had felt upon arrival were gone, replaced by a burning sense of purpose. The Duke had warned her not to act as a mother, to simply ensure the boy didn't destroy the house. But looking at the discarded boot, a symbol of the neglect disguised as discipline, Clara knew she could not keep that promise. She would not just watch over Arthur. She would fight for him. "Stay here, Arthur," she said, her voice ringing with the authority of the Lady Hallowell she used to be. "I have to speak with your father." Arthur watched her go, his small hand resting on his liberated foot. For the first time in months, he didn't pick up a toy to throw it. He simply watched the door, waiting to see if the lady with the sad eyes would come back. Clara marched down the corridor, her footsteps echoing with purpose. The storm outside was still raging, hammering against the stone walls of Wycliffe Hall, but the storm inside her was fiercer. She descended the servants' stairs and crossed the grand, empty hall toward the library. The footman she passed looked at her with surprise. Governesses usually scurried like mice, invisible and silent. Clara moved like a storm front. She didn't wait for Mrs. Grapes to announce her. She didn't knock with timid hesitation. She reached the double doors of the Duke's sanctuary and pushed them open. Sebastian Vance was exactly where she had left him, seated behind his desk, surrounded by the silence he cherished so much. He looked up, his quill pausing over a ledger, his eyebrows drawing together in a frown of displeasure. "Miss Hallowell," he said, his voice ice-cold. "I did not ring for you. Has he bitten you already? If you are here to resign, you may leave your trunk in the hall." Clara walked up to the desk. She placed her hands on the polished mahogany, leaning forward slightly, invading his space in a way no servant ever would. The firelight caught the gold of her hair and the verdant fire in her green eyes. "I am not here to resign, Your Grace," she said, her voice low but vibrating with intensity. "And Arthur is not mad. He is not violent by nature, and he is certainly not broken." Sebastian stood up slowly, towering over her, his eyes narrowing dangerously. "You have been with him for less than an hour. Do not presume to teach me about my own son." "I have been with him long enough to see what you have not," Clara shot back, fueled by the image of the raw skin on the boy's ankle. "He is in pain, physical, excruciating pain." "What are you talking about?" "His boot, Your Grace," Clara said, enunciating every word. "It is a cage. It is sizes too small for him. The iron is grinding into his bone. He throws things because it is the only way he can distract himself from the agony of walking. He is not a monster. He is a child who is being tortured by his own clothes." The silence that followed was different from the one before. It was the silence of a blow landing. Sebastian stared at her, the colour draining slightly from his face. He looked at her hands, which were trembling not from fear, but from anger, and then back to her eyes. "Too small," he repeated, the words sounding foreign in his mouth. "Look at his ankle," Clara challenged him. "Come upstairs and look at your son's leg, and then tell me that he is the one who is broken." She didn't wait for his permission. She turned and walked back toward the door, gambling everything, her position, her livelihood, her only chance at survival, on the hope that beneath the layers of ice and grief, the Duke of Wycliffe still possessed a heart that could beat for his son. She reached the doorway and paused, looking back. "He needs a doctor to fit a new brace, not a keeper to lock him away," she said. "If you will not send for one, I will walk to the village in this storm and fetch one myself." She left the room, leaving the door open behind her, a challenge hanging in the cold air of the library. Behind her, she heard the scrape of a chair being pushed back, and then the heavy, urgent footsteps of the Duke following her into the shadows. The heavy tread of boots on the nursery floorboards sounded like thunder rolling into a valley. Clara did not look up immediately. She remained kneeling beside Arthur, her hand resting protectively near his injured ankle, her gaze fixed on the red, angry indentation the iron had left on his pale skin. When she finally turned her head, she found the Duke of Wycliffe standing in the doorway, his chest heaving slightly, his presence filling the room with a suffocating intensity. He was not a man accustomed to being commanded, and certainly not by a governess who had been in his employ for less than an hour. Sebastian's eyes moved from Clara's defiant face to the small, huddled form of his son. For years, he had avoided this room. He had convinced himself that his absence was a mercy, that the boy was better off with professionals who knew how to manage his afflictions. He had paid exorbitant sums to doctors from London who prescribed heavy braces and strict discipline. He had believed them when they said the boy's screams were symptoms of his madness, a hysteria inherited from a mother who had despised them both. "Move," Sebastian said. The word was not a shout, but a low rasp that vibrated in the quiet room. Clara shifted aside, but did not rise. She watched as the Duke crossed the room, his movements stiff, as if he were walking toward an execution. He knelt on the floor, ignoring the dust that coated the knees of his pristine trousers. His large, gloved hands hovered over Arthur's leg. Then he stripped the gloves off, tossing them carelessly onto a pile of wooden blocks. When his bare fingers brushed the air near the wound, Arthur flinched violently, squeezing his eyes shut as if expecting a blow. The reaction was a knife to the gut. Sebastian froze. He looked at the boy's face, the terror etched into features that mirrored his own. And then at the leg. The evidence was undeniable. The leather was stiff as board, the iron brace rusted at the joints, and the size. It was a device meant for a toddler, not a growing boy of 6. The metal had bitten so deep it had nearly worn through the skin to the bone. "God in heaven," Sebastian whispered. The anger that had propelled him up the stairs vanished, replaced by a cold, hollow horror. He looked at Clara, his blue eyes wide and unguarded for the first time. "I paid them. The last governess, the physician from the village. I gave them whatever they asked for. They told me he needed the support. They told me the resistance was part of his condition. They were lazy, Your Grace," Clara said, her voice softening as she saw the genuine shock in his expression. She saw then that he was not a monster. He was a man blinded by grief and misled by those who saw his son as a burden rather than a child. It is easier to strap a child down than to listen to him. And when he screamed, they told you he was mad so they wouldn't have to admit they were hurting him. Sebastian reached out, his hand trembling, and very gently touched the calf above the wound. Arthur opened one eye, watching his father with suspicious wonder. Sebastian didn't speak. He couldn't. He simply bowed his head, the weight of 4 years of neglect crushing him. He had thought he was protecting the world from his son's madness, but he had only been protecting himself from his own pain, leaving Arthur to suffer in the dark. "I will send a rider to Carlisle tonight," Sebastian said, his voice thick. He stood up, the movement jagged. "The best orthopedic specialist in the north. If he has to ride through the storm, so be it." "And until then?" Clara asked, standing to face him. "Until then, burn that thing." Sebastian pointed to the boot lying on the floor. "Burn it in the grate. He does not wear it again. If he cannot walk, carry him. But do not put that iron back on his flesh." He turned to leave, pausing at the door without looking back. "Thank you, Miss Hallowell." The next 3 days were a revelation. The specialist from Carlisle arrived, a man with kind eyes and cold hands, who confirmed Clara's diagnosis with a click of his tongue. He measured Arthur's foot, cast a mould, and promised a new brace made of lighter steel and padded leather within the week. Until then, Arthur was confined to the nursery, but it was no longer a prison. Without the constant agony of the boot, the boy's temperament shifted like the weather after a storm. The violent outbursts ceased. The throwing of objects stopped. He was still silent. The mute wall he had built around himself remained intact. But the rage was gone. Clara spent the days reading to him, building complex cities with the blocks, and simply sitting in companionable silence. She noticed how he watched her, his dark eyes tracking her movements, drinking in the novelty of kindness. When the new boot arrived, it was a moment of high ceremony. The doctor fitted it, adjusting the straps until Arthur nodded that it was comfortable. Clara held her breath as the boy stood up. He wobbled, his balance uncertain after days of being carried. But then he took a step. Then another. There was a limp, profound and undeniable, but there was no grimace of pain. He walked across the nursery floor to the window, looked out at the grey sky. and then turned to look at Clara. A tiny, tentative smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was the first time she had seen him smile, and it felt like the sun breaking through the clouds over Wycliffe Hall. A week later, the rain finally ceased, leaving the world outside washed clean and glittering with frost. Clara, feeling the need to expand Arthur's world beyond the nursery, decided to explore the house. Sebastian had retreated to his study, burying himself in the management of his estates, though he now asked for daily reports on Arthur's progress. Reports he read with an intensity that betrayed his lingering guilt. Wycliffe Hall was a labyrinth of forgotten rooms. On the second floor of the east wing, Clara found a set of double doors that were locked, but the key rested on the moulding of the frame, forgotten by a careless maid. Curiosity, a trait she had never managed to suppress, compelled her to open them. It was a music room. Dust motes danced in the shafts of pale afternoon light that pierced through the heavy velvet curtains. In the centre of the room stood a grand pianoforte, draped in a white sheet like a ghost. Clara stepped inside, Arthur limping quietly beside her. The air smelled of stale resin and silence. "This must have been beautiful once," Clara whispered. She pulled the sheet from the piano, revealing polished mahogany that gleamed despite the dust. She hadn't touched a key in 3 years. Her own piano had been sold to pay her father's gambling debts, months before he died. Her fingers itched with a phantom memory of music. She sat on the bench, patting the space beside her. Arthur climbed up, his eyes wide. He had likely never seen such a beast. Clara pressed a single key. A middle C rang out, slightly out of tune but resonant and clear in the stillness. Arthur gasped, his hand flying to his mouth. "It's not magic, Arthur," Clara said softly. "It's mechanics, hammers and strings." She began to play. It was a simple nocturne, one she had learned as a girl, melancholic and sweet. Her fingers were stiff at first, stumbling over the complex transitions, but soon the muscle memory took over. The music filled the room, chasing away the shadows, filling the empty spaces of the house with a life it had not known for years. Arthur was transfixed. He didn't just listen, he felt the music. He leaned forward, placing his small hand on the wood of the piano case, feeling the vibrations of the strings. He closed his eyes, swaying slightly to the rhythm. It was a language he understood, one without words, without demands, purely emotional. Clara was so lost in the melody, so absorbed in the joy of playing and the peace on Arthur's face, that she did not hear the door open. Sebastian stood in the hallway, frozen. He had been on his way to the library when he heard it, the impossible sound of a piano. His first instinct had been anger. The music room had been his wife's domain. She had played with technical perfection, but no soul, using music as a weapon to drown out his attempts at conversation, banging the keys to express her disdain for their marriage and their defective son. He had ordered the room closed the day she died. But this music was different. It wasn't angry. It was like a weeping willow bending over a stream. Sad, graceful, and yielding. He stepped closer to the open door, moving silently on the runner carpet. He saw them framed by the light of the window. Clara, her head bent over the keys, the severe bun of her hair loosening, a few strands of gold escaping to frame her face. And Arthur, his son, was sitting beside her, not screaming, not hiding, but leaning into the music as if it were oxygen. Sebastian watched as Arthur reached out a tentative finger and pressed a high key, adding a discordant ping to Clara's melody. Instead of scolding him, Clara laughed. It was a warm, throaty sound that seemed to vibrate in Sebastian's own chest. She adjusted her playing, weaving Arthur's single note into the harmony, turning his interruption into a duet. Something tight and cold in Sebastian's chest, a knot that had been tied 4 years ago, began to loosen. He leaned against the doorframe, watching them, feeling like an intruder in his own home, yet unable to look away. He realized then that he didn't know his son at all. He had seen only the deformity and the silence. Clara Hallowell had been in the house for less than a fortnight, and she had found the boy's soul. The moment was shattered by the distant, jarring sound of carriage wheels grinding against gravel in the courtyard below. The music stopped abruptly. Clara lifted her hands from the keys, her spine straightening as reality rushed back in. "We should go, Arthur," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Your father might not like us being here." Sebastian stepped back into the shadows before they could see him, retreating down the hall. He needed to compose himself. He recognized the sound of that carriage. It was a specific, heavy cadence that signaled an invasion he had been dreading. By the time Clara and Arthur returned to the nursery, and Clara had tidied her hair, the summons came. Mrs. Grapes appeared, looking more harried than usual. "His Grace requests your presence in the drawing room for tea, Miss Hallowell." "And brings Master Arthur." "Tea?" Clara asked, confused. "With the Duke? With the Duke and his guests," Mrs. Grapes said ominously. "Lady Honoria has arrived. And she has brought Lady Eliza." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty corridors. Lady Honoria Vance, the Duke's aunt, was a woman whose reputation for viciousness was whispered about even in the circles Clara had once frequented. She was the matriarch who had controlled the family since Sebastian's parents died, and she had made it her life's mission to secure a proper match for the Duke and to erase the stain that was Arthur. Clara dressed Arthur in his best velvet suit, brushing his hair until it shone. She put on her own best dress, which was merely her cleanest grey wool, and led Arthur down the grand staircase. The drawing room was a battlefield disguised as a parlour. Sebastian stood by the fireplace, looking dark and impenetrable, a glass of brandy in his hand despite the early hour. Seated on the velvet sofa was an older woman with hair dyed a severe shade of black and eyes like polished jet. This was Lady Honoria. Beside her sat a younger woman, perhaps 20, with porcelain skin and a dress of expensive pink silk that looked ridiculous in the gloomy weather. Lady Eliza. "So this is the creature," Lady Honoria said as they entered. She wasn't looking at Clara. She was staring at Arthur with open disgust. "He walks. I was told he was a cripple." "He has a name, Aunt," Sebastian said, his voice sharp. "And yes, he walks. Miss Hallowell has seen to it." Honoria turned her gaze to Clara. It was a physical inspection, searching for flaws. "Miss Hallowell, a governess. You look rather young to be managing a household of this magnitude, and rather plain." "I am here to teach, Lady Honoria, not to decorate," Clara replied calmly, curtsying. She squeezed Arthur's hand, feeling him tremble. "And what do you teach?" Honoria sneered. "How to play with blocks. The boy needs discipline, Sebastian. He needs to be sent to Switzerland. There are institutions there." "He stays," Sebastian said, the finality in his tone making the crystal glasses on the tray rattle. "Tea, Miss Hallowell. Pour for us. Lady Eliza is parched." It was a test. Clara knew it immediately. In high society, the pouring of tea was a ritual steeped in subtle codes of rank and precedence. A servant would pour silently. A lady would preside. By asking her to pour, Sebastian was either testing her competence or using her as a shield against his aunt. Clara moved to the silver tea service. She felt the weight of 3 pairs of eyes on her. Lady Eliza watched with vacuous boredom. Sebastian watched with intensity. Honoria watched like a hawk waiting for a mouse to stumble. Clara lifted the heavy silver pot. She did not ask how they took their tea. She observed. She noted the delicate china, the specific blend of Earl Grey steaming in the pot. She poured a cup for Lady Honoria first, respect for age and rank, adding the milk last, as was the custom for fine china to prevent cracking, though for this quality of porcelain, it was a stylistic choice that signalled old money. She placed the cup on the saucer without a single rattle. "Lemon for Lady Eliza, I presume?" Clara asked, slicing a wedge without looking up. "Young ladies often find milk too heavy before dinner." Eliza blinked, surprised. "Why, yes. How did you know?" "A guess," Clara lied smoothly. It wasn't a guess. It was a rule of the season she had participated in 3 years ago. She handed the cup to Sebastian last. Their fingers brushed for a fraction of a second. His skin was warm, a shocking contrast to his icy demeanour. He looked at her, noting the grace of her movements, the straightness of her back, the way she held the saucer with 3 fingers, not 4. These were not the movements of a village girl or a working-class governess. These were the movements of a woman born to drawing rooms. Lady Honoria narrowed her eyes, the teacup pausing halfway to her lips. She had sensed it too. The predator had recognized prey that didn't belong in the herd. "You have excellent manners for a hireling, Miss Hallowell," Honoria said, her voice dropping to a dangerous purr. "Where exactly did you say your family was from? The accent. It isn't Cumberland. It sounds distinctly like London." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, but her face remained a mask of polite servitude. "My father was a clerk, my lady. He insisted on proper elocution. He believed it would help me find a good position." "A clerk," Honoria repeated, clearly not believing a word of it. "How quaint. And what was this clerk's name?" "Thomas," Clara said quickly. It was her father's middle name. "Thomas Hallowell." "Hallowell," Honoria mused, sipping her tea. "I knew a Viscount Hallowell once, a dreadful man, gambled away his fortune and left his family in ruin. A coward who took the easy way out with a pistol. No relation, I hope." The air in the room vanished. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She gripped the edge of the tea table, her knuckles turning white. She could feel the ghost of her father standing beside her, the shame of his death washing over her fresh and hot. Sebastian watched her. He saw the subtle flinch, the way her breath hitched. He knew his aunt was fishing, casting nets of cruelty to see what she could catch. "A common name, aunt," Sebastian interjected. His voice bored, but his eyes locked on Clara, offering her a strange, silent lifeline. "Do not bore us with ancient gossip. Miss Hallowell is here to discuss Arthur's progress, not her genealogy." Honoria set her cup down with a sharp clink. "Progress. Very well. Let us see this progress. The boy has been staring at the floor like an imbecile since he arrived. Does he speak, or is he still as mute as a stone?" Arthur shrank back against Clara's skirts. "He communicates in other ways," Clara said defensively, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Useless," Honoria spat. "A mute duke. The king will laugh us out of court. Sebastian, you must see reason. Lady Eliza has brought her sketchbook. She is accomplished, fertile, and sane. Marry her, sire a healthy heir, and send this mistake away." "That is enough," Sebastian said. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He stood up, and his height was terrifying. "Arthur is my son. He is the heir to Wycliffe, and he remains." "For now," Honoria said, standing as well, undeterred. "But the winter ball is approaching, Sebastian. You must present him. If he embarrasses the family, if he proves to be the mad animal everyone says he is, you will have no choice but to listen to me. The peerage will demand it." She turned to Clara, a cruel smile playing on her lips. "And you, Miss Hallowell, ensure he is ready, because if he fails, it will be on your head, and I will make sure you never work in England again." With a swish of silk, Honoria swept out of the room, taking the bewildered Lady Eliza with her. The heavy silence returned, but it was charged now, electric with threats and secrets. Sebastian turned to Clara. He looked at her hands, still gripping the table, and then at Arthur, who was trembling. "She will not stop," Sebastian said quietly. "She wants the title for her own line. She wants Arthur gone." "Then we must prove her wrong," Clara said, her voice shaking, but her resolve hardening like steel. "We have a month until the ball. I will teach him. He will not embarrass you." Sebastian looked at her, searching for the truth of who she really was, this woman who poured tea like a duchess and lied like a desperate survivalist. "See that you do, Miss Hallowell," he said softly. "For all our sakes." The garden party arranged by Lady Honoria was not a celebration. It was a trial by fire, disguised with cucumber sandwiches and expensive porcelain. The lawns of Wycliffe Hall, usually desolate and windswept, had been transformed into a stage for the local gentry to witness the spectacle of the Duke's damaged heir. A marquee of striped silk had been erected against the grey Cumberland sky. flapping aggressively in the biting wind that refused to acknowledge the season. Clara stood near the edge of the terrace, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to hide their trembling. She wore her grey wool dress, which looked hopelessly drab against the rainbow of silks and muslins worn by the guests Honoria had summoned. There were neighbours from the surrounding estates, a few curious minor nobles from Carlisle, and of course, Lady Eliza, who looked like a wilting peony in layers of pink ruffles. "He looks terrified," Clara whispered, though the wind snatched the words away before they could reach anyone. Arthur stood 10 paces away, sandwiched between his father and his great-aunt. He was dressed in a miniature version of a gentleman's riding habit, dark blue velvet that made his pale skin look translucent. He was standing upright, a feat that would have been impossible 2 weeks ago, thanks to the new brace hidden beneath his trousers. But his posture was rigid, his small hands clenched into fists at his sides. Sebastian Vance, the Duke of Wycliffe, looked no more comfortable than his son. He stood like a sentinel, his jaw set in a line of grim endurance. He had agreed to this farce only because Honoria had threatened to spread rumours of Arthur's insanity to London if he refused. He was trying to prove a point, but as the guests circled, whispering behind their fans and raising their quizzing glasses, the air felt heavy with judgment. And this is the boy? Lord Dandridge, a man with a complexion like boiled ham, boomed unnecessarily loud. He leaned down, peering at Arthur as one might inspect a prize pig at a county fair. "Small for his age, isn't he? And they say he hasn't spoken a word since the cradle." "He listens perfectly well, Lord Dandridge," Sebastian said, his voice cutting through the chatter like a blade. "Arthur, bow to his lordship." Arthur hesitated. His dark eyes darted around the circle of looming adults. To a child who had spent years in the isolation of a nursery, treated like a shameful secret, this crowd was a nightmare manifest. He looked toward Clara, his anchor. She gave him a small, encouraging nod, willing him to breathe. Arthur bowed. It was a jerky, uneven movement, hampered by his leg, but it was a bow. "Charming," Lady Honoria said, her tone dripping with artificial sweetness that fooled no one. She placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder, her long fingernails digging into the velvet. "We have high hopes that with the proper discipline, perhaps in a more structured environment abroad, he might one day be presentable." "He is presentable now," Clara said. She hadn't meant to speak. A governess was furniture. She was meant to be invisible until summoned. But the sight of Honoria's claw-like hand on the boy made her blood boil. Heads turned. Lady Honoria's eyes snapped toward Clara, cold and reptilian. "You speak out of turn, Miss Hallowell. Know your place." "My place is with my charge, my lady," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "And he is overwhelmed. He is 6 years old, and he is not a performer in a circus." A murmur of shock rippled through the guests. A governess correcting a noblewoman. It was unheard of. Sebastian turned his gaze to Clara. There was no anger in his eyes, only a strange, intense calculation. He looked as if he wanted to agree with her, but the social shackles of his station held him fast. "Nonsense!" Honoria scoffed, tightening her grip on Arthur. "He must learn to endure scrutiny. He is a Vance. Arthur, greet Lady Eliza. She is to be your new mother soon enough. Go on, shake her hand." She shoved him forward. It was a physical push, not gentle. Arthur stumbled. His bad leg caught on the uneven turf, and he pitched forward, barely catching himself before he fell at Lady Eliza's feet. Eliza gasped and recoiled, pulling her skirts back as if he were a rat that might bite her. "Oh, do be careful. My dress is Parisian silk." The rejection was absolute. Arthur froze. He looked up at the woman who was supposed to replace the mother he couldn't remember, and saw only disgust. He looked at the circle of faces, Lord Dandridge laughing, Honoria sneering, his father looking pained but distant. The wall of silence he had built to protect himself shattered, replaced by blind panic. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He turned and ran. "Arthur!" Sebastian shouted, taking a step forward. But Arthur was already moving. He was faster now. The new brace allowed him a mobility he had never known, and adrenaline fueled his small limbs. He didn't run toward the house. He ran toward the open grounds, toward the freedom of the wild gardens that sloped down toward the ornamental lake. "Let him go," Honoria said disdainfully. "He will stop when he runs out of breath. It is just another tantrum." Clara did not wait. She picked up her skirts, exposing her ankles in a scandalous breach of decorum, and sprinted. She didn't care about the guests. She didn't care about the muddy grass ruining her only pair of decent shoes. She only saw the small, dark figure disappearing over the ridge of the lawn. "Arthur, stop!" she cried out, her voice carried away by the wind. She crested the hill, and her heart stopped. The lake lay below, a grey, flat expanse of water bordered by reeds and slippery, moss-covered stones. It was deep, fed by underground springs that kept the water freezing even in summer. In late autumn, it was deadly. Arthur was scrambling down the embankment. He wasn't looking where he was going. He was just fleeing the eyes, the judgment, the laughter. His gait was uneven, lurching to the right with every step. "Arthur, no! The water!" Clara screamed, sliding down the wet grass, fighting for balance. He didn't hear her, or he didn't care. He reached the edge of the water. The mud at the bank was treacherous, a slurry of silt and decaying leaves. His good foot found purchase on a stone, but his braced foot slid. It happened in slow motion. Clara saw his arms windmill, his small face turned toward her, eyes wide with sudden realization of the danger. And then he was gone, slipping backward into the grey water with a splash that sounded deafening in the silence of the garden. "No!" The scream tore from Clara's throat. She didn't hesitate. She didn't think about the cold or the weight of her wool dress or the fact that she was a poor swimmer. She hit the water running. The shock was instantaneous. The cold was a physical blow, punching the air from her lungs. It felt like 1,000 needles piercing her skin. The water swirled around her waist, heavy and dragging, soaking the wool of her skirt instantly and turning it into an anchor that tried to pull her down. She saw Arthur thrashing. He had fallen into a drop-off near the reeds. His heavy boot was dragging him under. His head bobbed up, a flash of black hair, a gasping mouth, and then went under again. Clara lunged forward, the mud sucking at her shoes. She lost her footing and plunged face first into the freezing water. Panic flared, but she fought it down, kicking wildly until her hands found something solid. Cloth. Velvet. She grabbed the collar of his jacket and pulled. He was heavy, terrified, fighting her with the frantic strength of the drowning. "I have you! Arthur! I have you!" she gasped, spitting out brackish water. She hauled him toward her, finding her footing on the slippery bottom. The water was up to her chest now. She wrapped her arms around him, lifting him as high as she could, pressing his shivering body against hers. He clung to her, his small arms wrapping around her neck in a death grip, his face buried in her wet shoulder. "I've got you," she sobbed, staggering backward toward the bank. "You're safe. I've got you." Her legs were numb. The weight of the waterlogged dress was immense. She took one step, then another, fighting the suction of the mud. She looked up at the bank, hoping for a servant, a gardener, anyone. She saw Sebastian. He was tearing down the hill, his coat flying open, his face a mask of pure terror. He didn't stop at the edge. He splashed into the shallows, his expensive boots ruining in the mud, and reached out for them. "Give him to me," he commanded, his voice raw. He grabbed Arthur from her arms, lifting the boy effortlessly as if he weighed nothing. But he didn't turn away. He reached out with his other hand and grabbed Clara's arm, hauling her up the final few feet of the slippery bank with a strength that nearly lifted her off the ground. They collapsed onto the grass, a shivering, sodden trio. The wind bit through their wet clothes, cruel and sharp. Sebastian fell to his knees, clutching Arthur to his chest. He was shaking, not from the cold, but from the adrenaline crash. He checked the boy's face, brushing the wet hair from his eyes. Arthur was coughing, spitting up water, but he was breathing. He was alive. "You foolish boy," Sebastian whispered, his voice cracking. He pressed a kiss to the top of Arthur's wet head, a gesture so tender and uncharacteristic that it made Clara's heart ache. "You foolish, foolish boy." Clara sat on the grass a few feet away, her teeth chattering violently. Her dress was ruined, plastered to her skin, heavy with mud. Her hair had come loose from its pins and hung in wet, tangled rat tails around her face. She felt exposed, exhausted, and incredibly cold. The guests had reached the top of the hill now. They stood in a horrified semicircle, looking down at the scene. Lady Honoria was at the front, her face twisted in a sneer of distaste as she looked at the mud on the Duke's trousers. "Well," Honoria said loud enough for everyone to hear. "What a spectacle! A feral child running into a lake. It is exactly as I said. He is uncontrollable." Arthur stiffened in his father's arms. He turned his head. He saw Clara shivering on the ground. He saw the way she was looking at him. Not with anger, not with disappointment, but with sheer, terrifying relief. She had jumped into the freezing water for him. She had saved him when the others had only watched. He pulled away from Sebastian slightly and scrambled on his hands and knees through the mud toward Clara. "Arthur?" Sebastian asked, confused. The boy reached Clara. He reached out with a trembling, muddy hand and touched her cheek. His eyes locked onto hers, dark and intense, searching for something he had lost years ago. He needed to name the feeling that was swelling in his chest, the safety he felt in her arms, the ferocity with which she had defended him. He opened his mouth. His throat worked, rusty from years of disuse. Mo. The silence on the hill was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Sebastian went still as a statue. "Mother," Arthur croaked. The word was rough, barely a whisper, but it was unmistakable. He didn't look at Lady Eliza. He didn't look at the ghost of the woman who had birthed him. He looked at Clara Hallowell, the governess in the grey dress. "Mother," he said again, louder this time, crying the word like a prayer. He threw his arms around Clara's neck and buried his face in her shoulder, sobbing. Clara froze. The word hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. She wrapped her arms around the boy instinctively, rocking him, tears mixing with the lake water on her face. "I'm here," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm here." Sebastian stared at them. He felt as if the ground had shifted beneath him. His son, who had not spoken a syllable in 4 years, who had been branded an imbecile by doctors and family alike, had spoken. And the word he had chosen, it was a dagger to the heart of every social convention standing on that hill. "Did you hear that?" Lady Eliza whispered, sounding scandalized. "He called the servant mother." Lady Honoria stepped forward, her face turning a violent shade of red. She pointed a shaking finger at Clara. "Manipulation!" she shrieked. "This is witchcraft! She has twisted his mind. She has coached him to do this to humiliate us. Look at her, clinging to him like a limpet. She is trying to usurp his true family." "Silence," Sebastian said. He didn't shout, but the command had the weight of iron. He stood up slowly. He was covered in mud. His cravat was ruined. He looked nothing like the pristine Duke who had started the afternoon. And yet, he had never looked more powerful. He looked down at Clara and Arthur huddled together on the grass. "She saved his life," Sebastian said, turning to face his aunt. His voice was low, lethal. "While you stood there and worried about your silk, she went into the water." "She is a fortune hunter," Honoria spat. "She has clearly preyed on the boy's confusion. He called her mother. Sebastian, it is obscene. You must dismiss her immediately. Send her away before she corrupts him further." Sebastian looked back at Clara. She was looking up at him, fear in her eyes, not for herself, but for Arthur. She was terrified he would tear the boy away from her. He made his choice. He walked over to them. He didn't reach for Arthur this time. He reached for Clara. He extended his hand, palm up, dirty and wet. "Stand up, Miss Hallowell," he said gently. Clara stared at the hand. Slowly she reached out and took it. His grip was warm and firm. He pulled her to her feet, steadying her when she swayed from the cold. Arthur clung to her skirt, refusing to let go. "You will catch your death out here," Sebastian said. He took off his heavy coat, the coat bearing the ducal crest, and draped it over Clara's shoulders. The gesture drew a collective gasp from the crowd on the hill. A duke giving his coat to a governess was a breach of protocol so severe it was practically a declaration of war against society. "Sebastian!" Honoria gasped. "What are you doing?" Sebastian ignored her. He ignored Lady Eliza. He ignored the whispering neighbours. He scooped Arthur up into his arms, settling the boy on his hip, and then placed his other hand firmly on the small of Clara's back. "We are going inside," he announced to the open air. "The party is over. Remove yourselves from my grounds." He began to walk up the hill, guiding Clara and Arthur toward the house. He walked straight past his aunt, who stood with her mouth open, looking like a fish pulled from the river. He walked past Lady Eliza, who was clutching her pearls in horror. "You cannot simply leave," Honoria shouted after him. "Sebastian! This is social suicide. That woman is a nobody." Sebastian didn't pause. He didn't look back. He marched his shivering, broken, miraculous family toward the warmth of the hall, leaving the tea party and its cruelties to rot in the cold garden behind them. Inside the great hall, the servants rushed forward, gasping at the sight of their master and the governess dripping mud onto the marble. "Hot water," Sebastian barked at Mrs. Grapes. "Towels, brandy, and a fire in the nursery. Now." "Yes, Your Grace." The housekeeper scrambled, clapping her hands to mobilize the maids. They reached the foot of the stairs. Arthur was still sobbing quietly into Sebastian's neck, but his hand was reaching out, gripping the fabric of Clara's dress, terrified she would disappear. Sebastian stopped and turned to look at Clara. Her lips were blue. She was shaking violently under his heavy coat, but her eyes were clear. "He spoke," Sebastian whispered, as if saying it aloud would make it real. "Yes," Clara chattered. "He spoke. He called you mother." Clara looked down, shame and fear warring in her expression. I am sorry, Your Grace." He was confused. The fear, he didn't know what he was saying. Sebastian reached out and touched her chin, lifting her face so she had to look at him. His thumb brushed a smudge of mud from her jaw. The touch was intimate, electric. He knew exactly what he was saying. Sebastian murmured. He named the only person who has ever made him feel safe. He dropped his hand, stepping back as the maids arrived with blankets. "Go," he said, his voice rough. "Get warm, Clara, before you freeze." It was the first time he had used her Christian name. Before she could respond, he turned and carried his son up the stairs, the sound of the word, "Mother," still echoing in the vast, empty spaces of the house, changing everything forever. The silence that descended upon Wycliffe Hall in the days following the incident at the lake was not the empty, tomb-like quiet that had plagued the estate for years. It was a heavy, pregnant silence, charged with the electricity of unasked questions and secrets that were rapidly becoming too large to keep. The rain had returned, drumming a relentless rhythm against the stone walls, turning the world outside into a blur of grey and green. But inside, the atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. Sebastian Vance, the Duke of Wycliffe, found himself unable to retreat into the sanctuary of his ledgers and land management. He sat in his library, the heavy oak door slightly ajar, listening. He was not a man given to eavesdropping. He considered it beneath his station and his character. Yet, for the past 3 evenings, he had found himself straining his ears to catch the sounds drifting down from the nursery wing. He heard the soft murmur of reading, the occasional melodic chime of the piano, and, most miraculously, the small tentative sounds of his son interacting with the world. A laugh, a hum, the thud of feet running without the heavy drag of pain. But it was not his son who occupied his thoughts in the darkest hours of the night. It was Miss Hallowell, the image of her rising from the mud, wrapped in his coat, her eyes fierce with a protective rage that rivaled a lioness, would not leave him. Nor would the memory of the tea party. The way she had poured the Earl Grey, milk last, the cup held just so. The way she had silenced Honoria, not with insolence, but with a terrifyingly perfect application of etiquette. And then, there was the matter of the French. Earlier that afternoon, passing the open nursery door, Sebastian had paused. Clara was sitting by the window, a book of fables open on her lap. She was reading to Arthur, but she was not reading in English. Le corbeau, honteux et confus, jura, mais un peu tard, qu'on ne l'y prendrait plus. she'd recited, her voice dipping into the perfect guttural rhythm of a Parisian native. Arthur blinked up at her, caught between the strange music of the words and the story behind them. "What did he say?" he whispered, as if afraid the raven might hear. Clara smiled and answered in English, soft enough to be only for him. The raven, ashamed and confused, swore, a little too late, that no one would ever trick him again. Sebastian had studied languages at Oxford. He had toured the continent before the wars, when travel still felt uncomplicated. He knew the difference between the stilted, textbook French taught to governesses to make them more employable, and the fluid, musical cadence of a woman who had been raised hearing the language spoken in salons. Miss Hallowell's accent was flawless. It was the accent of the aristocracy, not the schoolroom. He looked down at the paper on his desk. It was the letter of reference she had provided upon her arrival. It was signed by a Mrs. Miller of York, praising Clara's needlepoint and piety. It was brief, vague, and, Sebastian was now certain, entirely fabricated. He stood up, the chair scraping harsh against the floorboards. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows across the rows of leather-bound books. He could not tolerate the mystery any longer. He needed to know who had saved his son. He needed to know who was living in his house. He rang the bell pull. When the footman appeared, looking sleepy and startled, Sebastian didn't look up from the fire. "Request Miss Hallowell's presence in the library." "Immediately." "It is past 10 o'clock, Your Grace," the footman ventured, a breach of protocol that spoke to the unusual nature of the request. "Did I ask for the time?" Sebastian's voice was low, dangerous. "No, Your Grace, I will fetch her at once." 10 minutes later, the door opened. Clara entered. She had clearly been preparing for bed. She wore a simple dress of dark blue wool, lacking the stiff structure of her day clothes, and her hair was tied back in a loose braid that hung over her shoulder. She looked younger in the firelight, stripped of the severe governess uniform, but she also looked more guarded. Her green eyes were wide, scanning the room for danger. "You sent for me, Your Grace?" she asked, stopping a respectful distance from the desk. She did not curtsy. It was a small detail, but Sebastian noticed it. At this hour, in this room, the pretense seemed to be slipping. "Close the door, Miss Hallowell," Sebastian said. He moved to the side table, where a crystal decanter of brandy sat catching the light. "And lock it." Clara hesitated. The request was improper. For a duke to be locked in a room with an unmarried employee at night was the stuff of scandal, but she did not argue. She turned, the key clicking softly in the lock, and faced him again. Her chin was high, her hands clasped in front of her to hide a tremor he could still sense. "Is Arthur unwell?" she asked. "Arthur is asleep," Sebastian said. He poured 2 glasses of amber liquid. He turned and held one out to her. "Drink." Clara stared at the glass. "I do not drink spirits, Your Grace. It is not fitting for a governess?" Sebastian finished for her. He walked toward her, forcing her to take the glass or risk him dropping it. She took it, her fingers brushing his, cold against his warmth. "But we both know you are not merely a governess, don't we?" Clara took a step back, her grip on the crystal tightening. "I do not know what you mean. I have performed my duties. Arthur is walking. He has spoken. If you are displeased. Sebastian let out a short, humorless laugh. He walked past her, circling her like a wolf inspecting a trap. "I am astonished. I am grateful. But I am not a fool, and I will not be played for one in my own home. Who are you?" "I am Clara Hallowell," she said, her voice steady but lacking the conviction it had held before. "Yes, Hallowell," Sebastian mused. "A common name, you said. A clerk's daughter, you claimed. And yet you speak French with the accent of the Faubourg Saint-Germain. You pour tea with the protocol of a duchess. You stood on that hill and stared down Lady Honoria Vance, a woman who has made grown men weep, without blinking. A clerk's daughter does not possess that kind of steel, Miss Hallowell. That kind of steel is forged in a different fire." He stopped directly in front of her, looming tall and dark in the flickering light. He could smell the soap she used, lavender and plain lye, masking a scent that was uniquely hers. "Tell me the truth," he commanded softly. "Or leave my house tonight. Clara looked up at him. She saw the intelligence in his eyes, the relentless pursuit of facts that defined him. She realized the game was over. The exhaustion of maintaining the lie, of constantly checking her words, her posture, her memories, suddenly crashed down on her. She had been running for 3 years. Perhaps it was time to stop. She took a sip of the brandy. It burned her throat, a familiar grounding heat that reminded her of her father's library, of a life that felt like a dream. "You knew a Viscount Hallowell," she said quietly. It was not a question. Sebastian nodded slowly. "I knew of him, Lord Thomas Hallowell, a man of charm and poor judgment. He lost his fortune at the card tables and his life by his own hand 3 years ago. He was not a bad man," Clara said, her voice trembling with a sudden, fierce defense. "He was weak. He was addicted to the thrill of the turn, to the promise that the next hand would fix everything. But he loved us. He loved me." She looked down at the brandy swirling in the glass. "I am Lady Clara Hallowell, his only daughter." The confirmation hung in the air. Sebastian let out a breath he didn't know he had been holding. It fit. The pieces slid into place. The arrogance, the education, the pride that refused to bow even when she was on her knees in the mud. "And when he died," Sebastian prompted. "He left nothing," Clara said, her voice devoid of self-pity, reciting the facts of her ruin. "Less than nothing. He left debts that swallowed the estate, the townhouse, the furniture, even my mother's jewellery. The creditors took everything. The society that had eaten at our table and danced in our ballroom turned their backs the moment the gavel fell. I was 23. I had no dowry, no family, and a name that was synonymous with scandal and cowardice. I was unmarriageable and destitute." She looked up at him again, her eyes dry and burning. "So I became Miss Hallowell. I learned to dress in grey. I learned to lower my eyes. I learned to be invisible. Because survival, Your Grace, does not care about lineage. Hunger feels the same to a viscount's daughter as it does to a scullery maid." Sebastian watched her, feeling a profound shift in the tectonic plates of his understanding. He had thought he was hiring a servant. Instead, he had harboured a survivor of the same brutal world he inhabited. She was not beneath him. She was his equal who had fallen from the cliff edge he walked every day. "You lied to get this position," Sebastian said. But the accusation lacked heat. "I did," Clara admitted. "No one hires a fallen aristocrat to teach their children. They fear the scandal. They fear the bad blood. I needed to eat. I needed to live." She set the glass down on a side table with a decisive click. "If you wish to dismiss me, I ask only for a reference that does not mention my name. I will go to Scotland. I hear there are positions there." She turned to the door, her dignity wrapped around her like armour. "Stop," Sebastian said. Clara froze, her hand on the key. "I did not say you were dismissed," Sebastian said. He walked back to his desk and picked up a piece of heavy cream paper, an invitation. He looked at it for a long moment before turning back to her. "In fact, your deception is perhaps the most fortunate thing that has happened to this family in a decade." Clara turned around, confusion furrowing her brow. "I do not understand." "My aunt," Sebastian said, tapping the invitation against his palm. "Lady Honoria. She has not given up. The incident at the lake. She is spinning it. She is telling anyone who will listen that Arthur is dangerous, that he attacked you, that you only saved him from his own madness. She plans to petition the king to have him declared incompetent and removed from my custody. She claims a single man, a widower, cannot raise a child with such afflictions." Clara gasped. "That is a lie. He was frightened. He is a child." "Truth does not matter in London, Lady Clara," Sebastian said, using her title with deliberate weight. "Perception matters. And the perception is that Wycliffe Hall is a house of madness and grief. I need to change that perception. I need to prove that Arthur is stable, that his environment is wholesome, and that he is being raised by appropriate influences." He walked toward her again, stopping only when he was close enough to see the gold flecks in her green eyes. I cannot walk into the winter ball with a governess on my arm, he said softly. It would confirm every rumour Honoria has started, that I am sleeping with the help, that I have lost my standards. But if I were to walk in with Lady Clara Hallowell, the daughter of a viscount, a woman of breeding who has tragically fallen on hard times but has been taken in by the benevolent Duke as a companion to his son. Clara stared at him, her mind racing to catch up with his logic. You want me to play a role? I want you to be yourself, Sebastian corrected. I want you to attend the winter ball, not as a servant, not in grey wool. I want you to attend as my guest, as my equal. I want the world to see you with Arthur, to see the way he looks at you, the way he trusts you. If a woman of your lineage accepts him, accepts us, it validates him. It silences the whispers. It is a dangerous game, Clara whispered. Once they know who I am, the old scandals will resurface. They will call me the gambler's daughter. They will say I am hunting for a title. Let them talk, Sebastian said, his voice hard with resolve. Let them talk about you and me. Let them speculate about a romance. Let them gossip about my intentions. As long as they are looking at us, they are not looking at Arthur's leg. As long as they are wondering if I am going to propose to you, they are not wondering if my son belongs in an asylum. The proposition hung between them, audacious and terrifying. He was asking her to step back into the light that had burned her. He was asking her to expose herself to the vipers who had rejected her, all to protect a boy who was not her own. But then she thought of Arthur. She thought of his small hand in hers, of the word mother whispered against her neck. She thought of the boot burning in the grate. I have nothing to wear, Clara said, a practical objection masking her terrified agreement. My silks were sold years ago. Sebastian's expression softened, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. It was the first time she had seen anything approaching warmth on his face, and it transformed him. He looked less like a statue and more like a man. The attic is full of trunks, he said. My grandmother's things. My mother's. There are fabrics there that haven't seen the light of day in 50 years. Find something. Have the village seamstress alter it. Spare no expense. Put it on my account. He reached out and took her hand again. This time, he didn't just brush her fingers. He held them. His thumb traced the calluses on her palm, the evidence of her labour, the badges of her survival. We are partners in this, Clara, he said. You saved my son's life. Now, I am asking you to save his future. Clara looked at their joined hands. The distance between Duke and governess had evaporated, replaced by a pact between two people who had been scarred by the world and refused to break. I will do it, she said clearly. For Arthur, Sebastian agreed. He released her hand slowly, the loss of contact leaving a strange coldness on her skin. Now go to bed. We leave for London in 2 days. And Clara? She paused at the door. Yes, Your Grace? Stop calling me that, he said, turning back to the fire. When we are in London, when we are playing this charade, you must call me Sebastian. We must make them believe. Good night, Sebastian, she whispered. She unlocked the door and slipped out into the corridor. The house was still silent, but the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt like the hush before a battle. Clara Hallowell was dead. Lady Clara had returned, and she would walk into the lion's den of London society with a duke at her side, ready to burn it all down if they dared to touch the boy she had chosen to love. The next 2 days passed in a blur of activity that disrupted the stagnant rhythm of Wycliffe Hall. Clara, armed with the Duke's permission and a ring of keys provided by a stunned Mrs. Grapes, ascended to the attics. The servants watched her with new wariness. The dynamic had shifted. She was no longer eating in the kitchen. She was dining with the Duke and Arthur. She was no longer wearing the grey uniform. She was overseeing the unpacking of silks and velvets that smelled of lavender and history. In the dusty light of the attic, Clara found her armour. It was a gown of deep emerald velvet, preserved in a cedar chest. It was old-fashioned, the waistline slightly too low for the current mode, but the fabric was exquisite, shivering with light. It was the colour of deep forests and hidden depths. It was the colour of life returning to a frozen world. The village seamstress, a woman named Mrs. Gable, who usually darned socks and hemmed wool, nearly wept when she touched the fabric. She worked through the night, fueled by coin from the Duke's purse and the sheer romance of the task. They raised the waist, lowered the neckline to a daring cut that emphasized Clara's long neck, and tightened the sleeves. When Clara tried it on in front of the cracked mirror in her room, she didn't recognize herself. The grey mouse was gone. The woman staring back was regal, imposing, and undeniably beautiful. The velvet brought out the green fire in her eyes and the gold in her hair. She looked like a duchess. Downstairs, the preparations for the journey were finalized. The ducal carriage, a behemoth of black lacquer and gold crests, was brought out and polished. Sebastian moved through the house with a restless energy. He spent hours in the nursery with Arthur, explaining the trip. "We are going to a party," Sebastian told the boy, kneeling to be at eye level. "There will be many people. They will be loud. But Clara will be there, and I will be there. You do not have to speak to anyone if you do not wish to, but you must be brave." Arthur, sitting on the floor with his new brace hidden under tailored trousers, looked at his father. He nodded solemnly. He did not speak. The word mother had been a burst of emotion, not a breaking of the dam, but his eyes were clear. He trusted them. On the morning of their departure, the sky finally cleared. A pale, watery sun illuminated the frost on the moors. Sebastian waited by the carriage, dressed in a travelling coat with a many-caped collar. When Clara emerged from the house, wearing a dark travelling cloak over her simple dress, the velvet gown packed safely in the trunk, he extended his hand to help her up. "Ready?" he asked quietly. "No," Clara admitted, "but I will not let you down." "I know," Sebastian said. He handed her into the carriage, then lifted Arthur in, settling the boy on the seat opposite. As the carriage lurched forward, leaving the safety of Wycliffe Hall behind, Clara looked back at the stone fortress. She was leaving as a fraud and returning to the city that had destroyed her. But as she looked at Sebastian, who was watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch, she realized she was no longer alone. The journey to London would take days, days in the confined intimacy of the carriage, days to practice their lie, days to blur the lines between what was pretend and what was terrifyingly, dangerously real. As the carriage rolled through the iron gates, Sebastian leaned forward. "Tell me about your father," he said. "If we are to be intimate acquaintances, I must know the ghosts that haunt you." Clara looked out the window at the passing moors. "Only if you tell me about your wife," she countered softly. Sebastian stiffened, the old walls threatening to rise. But then he looked at Arthur, who had fallen asleep with his head against the squabs, looking peaceful. "Fair enough," Sebastian said. "We have a long road ahead, Clara. Let us trade our ghosts." And as the wheels turned, grinding the miles toward the capital, the stories began to flow, knitting them together into a force that London was not prepared to face. The winter was coming, but inside the carriage, a new fire had been kindled. The journey to London had been a blur of rattling wheels and grey landscapes, but the arrival in the capital was an assault on the senses. The city was a beast that never slept, a sprawling labyrinth of soot, stone, and gaslight that smelled of coal smoke and horse manure. For Arthur, who had known only the silence of the moors, it was terrifying. For Clara, it was a return to the graveyard of her former life. They stayed at the Duke's townhouse in Grosvenor Square, a palatial residence that had been shuttered for years. Servants moved like ghosts, pulling dust sheets from furniture and polishing silver that hadn't seen the candlelight since the Duchess died. But there was no time to settle, no time to breathe. The winter ball, the highlight of the pre-Christmas season, was tonight. Clara stood before the tall cheval mirror in her guest chamber, staring at a stranger. The seamstress in Cumberland had performed a miracle. The emerald green velvet gown was not merely a dress, it was a declaration of war. It hugged her waist, the heavy fabric cascading to the floor in rich, shimmering folds that caught the light with every movement. The neckline was cut wide and low, displaying the creamy slope of her shoulders and the long, elegant line of her neck. It was a dress meant for a woman who commanded attention, not one who hid in the shadows. Her hair had been swept up by a Parisian maid Sebastian had hired immediately upon their arrival. Another expense, another layer of the charade. It was piled high in intricate curls, woven with velvet ribbons that matched the gown. She wore no jewellery. Her mother's diamonds were long gone. But the lack of ornamentation only served to highlight her natural, striking beauty. "You look—" Clara turned. Sebastian stood in the doorway. He was breathtaking. He wore formal evening dress, a black tailcoat cut to perfection, a crisp white waistcoat, and a cravat tied with geometric precision. The severity of the black and white only emphasized the piercing blue of his eyes and the broadness of his shoulders. He stopped, his gaze travelling over her, lingering on the curve of her neck and the way the green velvet turned her eyes into jewels. He didn't finish his sentence. He didn't need to. The heat in his stare said more than any compliment. "Is Arthur ready?" Clara asked, her voice breathless. "He is with the nurse. He is terrified," Sebastian admitted, stepping into the room. He closed the distance between them, offering her a small velvet box. "You cannot go without jewels, Clara. The wolves will smell the poverty." Clara opened the box. Inside lay a necklace of emeralds and diamonds, heavy and ancient. The central stone was the size of a quail's egg. It was the Wycliffe emeralds, a family heirloom she had seen in portraits. "I cannot wear this," she whispered, stepping back. "Sebastian, this belongs to the Duchess, to your wife. If I wear this—" "My wife is dead," Sebastian said, his voice hard. "And these jewels are mine to bestow. You are Lady Clara Hallowell tonight. You are the woman who saved my son. You will wear them." He took the necklace from the box. "Turn around." Clara obeyed. She felt the cold metal against her skin, and then the warmth of his fingers as he fastened the clasp at the nape of her neck. His hands lingered for a moment, his breath ghosting over her shoulder, sending a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the drafty window. "Perfect," he murmured near her ear. Downstairs, Arthur was waiting. He looked like a miniature prince in a black velvet suit. He was pale, his hands clutching the banister. But when he saw Clara descending the stairs in her emerald armour, his eyes widened. He didn't see the jewels or the expensive fabric. He saw his safety. He limped toward her, and she crouched down, ignoring the risk of creasing the velvet, to look him in the eye. "We are a team," she whispered to him. "You, me, and your father. We walk in, we hold our heads high, and we leave. Can you do that for me?" Arthur nodded, swallowing hard. He reached out and took her hand. Sebastian took his other hand. "Let them look," Sebastian said, signalling the footman to open the doors. "Let them see what they have forgotten." But the ball was held at the residence of the Duchess of Richmond, a cavernous ballroom that seemed to stretch for miles under a ceiling painted with cherubs and clouds. 500 candles burned in crystal chandeliers, casting a golden, unforgiving light over the cream of British society. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax, expensive perfume, and the undercurrent of gossip. The arrival of the Duke of Wycliffe had been anticipated for weeks. The rumours of his seclusion, his mad son, and his refusal to remarry were the fuel of every drawing-room conversation. When the major domo banged his staff against the floor, the music, a lively quadrille, did not stop, but the conversation did. A hush fell over the room, starting near the doors and rippling outward like a wave. "His Grace, the Duke of Wycliffe!" the announcer bellowed, his voice echoing off the frescoed ceiling. "Lord Arthur Vance," and then a pause, a hesitation that had been scripted by Sebastian himself. "And Lady Clara Hallowell." They stepped into the light. It was a moment of pure theatre. Sebastian, tall and imposing, a figure of dark power. Arthur, walking with a pronounced limp, but with his head held high, his small face a mask of determination. And between them, holding Arthur's hand, was Clara. The crowd parted. It was the Red Sea effect that every debutante dreamed of, but few achieved. The guests fell back, creating a wide aisle of polished floor. Fans snapped open. Monocles were raised. The silence was absolute, save for the rustle of silk and the rhythmic clack-drag of Arthur's step. Is that the Hallowell girl? Good God, look at the emeralds. Those are the Wycliffe emeralds. I thought she was dead. Or in a workhouse. Clara heard the whispers. They were like the hissing of snakes in a pit. She felt the weight of hundreds of eyes dissecting her appearance, judging the cut of her dress, estimating the value of the stones around her neck, remembering the sins of her father. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. But she did not falter. She felt Sebastian's presence beside her, a solid wall of protection. She felt Arthur's small, sweating hand in hers. They walked the length of the room. It felt like walking to the gallows, but they made it to the dais where the Duchess of Richmond sat. Sebastian bowed. Clara curtsied, deep, graceful, perfect. Arthur, copying his father, offered a stiff bow. Your Grace, Sebastian said, his voice carrying easily in the quiet room. Thank you for welcoming my son to his first season. The Duchess of Richmond, an ancient woman with sharp eyes who had seen everything, looked from Sebastian to Clara. She saw the emeralds. She saw the way Arthur clung to Clara's hand. A slow, knowing smile spread across her face. Wycliffe, she croaked. And Lady Clara, it has been too long. You have grown into a beauty. Your mother would have been proud. It was a blessing, a sanction. The tension in the room broke. If the Duchess of Richmond accepted them, the rest of the room had to follow suit. The music swelled again. The crowd began to move, though the eyes never left them. Sebastian led them to a quieter corner near the terrace doors, shielding Arthur from the crush. You did well, he murmured to Clara. Breathe. I am breathing, Clara lied. I just don't think my lungs are working. They are terrified of you, Sebastian said, scanning the room with a cynical sneer. They don't know how to categorize you. Are you my mistress? My fiancée? My charity case? The uncertainty drives them mad. I prefer governess, Clara said dryly. Tonight, you are none of those things. You are the queen of the board. Arthur tugged on Clara's hand. He pointed to the buffet table where a tower of spun sugar stood. Hungry? Clara asked. Arthur nodded. I will fetch a plate, Sebastian said. Stay here. Do not move. He stepped away, disappearing into the press of colourful coats. Clara stood with her back to a marble pillar, keeping Arthur between her and the wall. She scanned the room, looking for threats. She saw curious glances, envious stares, but no one approached. The barrier of the Wycliffe reputation was holding, until the crowd parted again. Lady Honoria Vance did not walk. She glided, like a shark cutting through water. She was dressed in stiff purple silk that rustled aggressively. Flanking her were two other matrons, her lieutenants in the War of Gossip, and Lady Eliza, who looked miserable in yellow. Honoria stopped 5 feet from Clara. Her eyes went immediately to the necklace. Her face, already pinched, went white with fury. You have audacity. I will give you that, Honoria said. Her voice was not loud, but it was pitched to carry to the nearby groups. To wear my mother's jewels, to parade around London society draped in the family heirlooms like a common courtesan. Clara straightened her spine. She felt Arthur flinch against her leg. She placed a hand on his shoulder. I am here as the Duke's guest, Lady Honoria, and I am wearing what he asked me to wear. His guest! Honoria laughed, a brittle, cruel sound. Is that what we are calling it? You are a paid employee, Miss Hallowell. A servant who has crawled into her master's bed and raided his jewellery box. The nearby conversations stopped. The circle of listeners began to form, sensing blood. You are mistaken, Clara said coldly. And you are upsetting the boy. The boy! Honoria sneered, looking down at Arthur. Look at him, cowering behind your skirts. He is a cripple and a simpleton, and you are parading him around like a pet monkey to gain sympathy. It is grotesque. Arthur made a small, keening sound. He pressed his face into the velvet of Clara's dress, his hands covering his ears. The music seemed to distort, the lights becoming too bright, the faces around him twisting into masks of mockery. "Stop it!" Clara hissed. "Leave him be!" "I will not stop," Honoria declared, her voice rising. She turned to the crowd, addressing the room at large. "Do you all know who this is? You bow to her, you admire her dress, but do you know who stands before you? This is the daughter of Thomas Hallowell, the cheat, the man who sat at your tables, drank your wine, and marked the cards to steal your fortunes." A gasp rippled through the onlookers. The name Hallowell was still poison. "She is the spawn of a liar and a thief," Honoria shouted, pointing an accusing finger. "She has no money, no honour, and no place in this room. She has seduced my nephew to get her hands on the Wycliffe fortune, just as her father tried to steal yours. She is a fraud." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and toxic. The guests recoiled. The Red Sea effect reversed. Instead of parting with respect, they backed away in disgust. Clara stood alone in the centre of the circle, exposed. She felt the old shame burning her skin. She saw the judgment in their eyes, the confirmation that she was, after all, trash wrapped in velvet. Arthur began to cry. It wasn't a tantrum. It was a sound of pure distress, a high-pitched wail of a child who feels the hatred directed at the person he loves. He fell to his knees, clutching his leg, rocking back and forth. "See?" Honoria triumphed. "Madness. He is having a fit. The line is tainted." Clara dropped to her knees, ignoring the gasps as her expensive dress hit the floor. She wrapped her arms around Arthur, shielding him with her body, burying his face in her neck to muffle the noise of the crowd. "It's all right," she whispered fiercely into his hair. "I've got you. Ignore them." But she couldn't ignore them. The laughter was starting. The whispers were turning into jeers. "Enough!" The word cracked through the room like a gunshot. Sebastian pushed through the circle of people. He didn't just walk, he stormed. His face was a mask of thunderous rage. He looked at his aunt, then at the crowd, then at Clara and Arthur huddled on the floor. He didn't help them up immediately. He turned his back on them, placing himself between his family and the mob. He stood like a shield wall, his blue eyes blazing with a cold fire that terrified even the boldest gossipers. "You speak of honour, aunt?" Sebastian asked. His voice was dangerously quiet, yet it reached every corner of the silent room. "You stand there, in your diamonds and your silk, and you attack a child. You attack a woman who has more nobility in her little finger than you possess in your entire soul." "She is a Hallowell," Honoria screeched, losing her composure. "She is the daughter of a cheat. She is Lady Clara Hallowell," Sebastian corrected, his voice rising, resonating with the full authority of the dukedom. "Yes, her father fell. Yes, he sinned. But since when do we punish the child for the crimes of the father? Is that the society we are? Are we wolves who eat the wounded?" He took a step toward the crowd, challenging them. "You look at her and you see a scandal. I look at her and I see the woman who walked into a house of silence and brought music back to it. I see the woman who jumped into a freezing lake to save the heir of Wycliffe when his own blood," he glared at Honoria, "stood on the bank and worried about her shoes." A ripple of shock went through the room. The lake incident had been rumoured, but never confirmed. "This woman," Sebastian continued, his voice shaking with emotion, "found my son when he was lost in the dark. She healed him when I was too blind to see his pain. She is not a fraud. She is the saviour of my house." He turned back to Clara. He extended his hand. "Stand up, Lady Clara," he commanded gently. Clara looked up. Tears were streaming down her face, but she took his hand. He pulled her to her feet, and then he bent down and scooped Arthur up into his arms. The boy buried his face in his father's shoulder, finally silent. Sebastian put his free arm around Clara's waist, pulling her flush against his side. It was a possessive, undeniable gesture. He looked at the room, daring anyone to speak. "Anyone who insults this woman," Sebastian declared, his eyes locking with Lord Dandridge, then with the Duchess of Richmond, "insults me. Anyone who closes their door to her closes their door to Wycliffe. If you wish to mock her lineage, you will answer to me." He turned his gaze to Honoria. She was trembling, pale and defeated. She realized, too late, that in trying to destroy Clara, she had forced Sebastian to claim her. "We are leaving," Sebastian announced. "This air is too stale for my son." He turned and walked toward the exit, his arm tight around Clara, his son safe in his arms. The crowd didn't just part this time. They bowed. They bowed not out of politeness, but out of awe. They had expected a scandal. Instead, they had witnessed a king defending his queen. As they reached the doors, the Duchess of Richmond began to clap. It was a slow, solitary applause. Then another joined in. Then another. It wasn't thunderous. It was respectful. It was the sound of society acknowledging that the rules had just changed. They stepped out into the cool night air of the terrace, leaving the heat and the noise behind. The carriage was waiting. Sebastian handed Arthur to the footman to be settled inside, then turned to Clara. Her adrenaline was fading, leaving her shaking. "You," she stammered. "You told them. I told them the truth," Sebastian said. He reached out and touched the emeralds at her throat, his fingers brushing her pulse. "You are the savior of my house, Clara, and I will burn London to the ground before I let them hurt you again." He leaned in, pressing a kiss to her forehead, a seal of protection, a promise of something more terrified and tender than either of them was ready to name. "Let's go home," he whispered. But home, Clara realized as she climbed into the carriage, was no longer a place on a map. Home was the man sitting opposite her, looking at her as if she were the only woman in the world. The return to Wycliffe Hall felt less like a retreat and more like a victory march, though the winter snows were beginning to close in around Cumberland, turning the roads into treacherous ribbons of white. For a fortnight, the estate breathed a sigh of relief. The shadows that had haunted the corners of the great house seemed to have been banished by the memory of the London ball. Arthur was playing in the corridors, his laughter, a sound once foreign to these stone walls, echoing as he dragged a wooden horse on a string. Clara and Sebastian moved around each other with a new, charged awareness, a silent acknowledgement of the bond forged in the fires of society's judgment. But peace, in the Vance family history, was a fragile creature. It shattered on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks before Christmas. A rider arrived from the Western collieries, his horse lathered and blowing hard in the freezing air. There had been a collapse in shaft number 4. Men were trapped. The foreman needed the Duke's authority to divert the river water to prevent a secondary explosion, a decision that carried financial ruin, but would save lives. Sebastian didn't hesitate. He was in his riding leathers within 10 minutes, his face grim. "I must go," he told Clara in the entrance hall, pulling on his heavy gloves. "If I ride hard, I can be there by noon. I will oversee the rescue and return by tomorrow evening." "Go," Clara said, adjusting the collar of his coat, a gesture of familiarity that made his eyes darken with unspoken emotion. "We will be fine here. Mrs. Grapes has the house in hand, and Arthur has his lessons." Sebastian looked at her, a flicker of unease crossing his features. He didn't like leaving them, not with Honoria's threats still ringing in his ears from London. But the duty of his rank was a chain he could not break. "Keep the doors locked. I have doubled the gamekeepers on the perimeter." "We are safe, Sebastian," she assured him. "Save your men." He mounted his black stallion and thundered out of the courtyard, a dark blur against the snow. Clara watched him go until he disappeared into the tree line, a strange chill settling in the pit of her stomach that had nothing to do with the winter wind. The attack did not come with soldiers or battering rams. It came with the polite, terrifying rustle of legal papers. It was mid-afternoon when the carriage arrived. It was not the Wycliffe crest on the door, but a generic black rental from Carlisle. Clara was in the library, organising the accounts, a task Sebastian had entrusted to her, when the commotion started in the hall. She heard Mrs. Grapes's voice, shrill with indignation, and then a deeper, oily baritone that made her skin crawl. Clara emerged from the library just as the visitors pushed past the protesting housekeeper. Lady Honoria Vance stood in the centre of the hall, wrapped in furs, her face a mask of triumphant malice. Beside her stood a man Clara did not know, a tall, skeletal figure, with wire-rimmed spectacles and a bag that smelled of camphor and ether. Behind them were two burly men in rough coats, looking less like servants and more like tavern brawlers hired for a night's work. "Lady Honoria," Clara said, her voice icy. "His Grace is not in residence. You are trespassing." "I am not here for my nephew," Honoria said, peeling off her gloves with slow, deliberate movements. "I am here for the boy, and I am here with the authority of the Crown." She gestured to the skeletal man. "This is Dr. Thorne. He is a specialist in juvenile hysteria and hereditary madness. And this," she held up a piece of parchment, sealed with red wax, "is a writ of emergency custody, signed by the magistrate of Carlisle." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "On what grounds?" "Negligence," Dr. Thorne spoke up. His voice was dry, like leaves skittering on stone. "And moral endangerment. Lady Honoria has provided sworn testimony regarding the incident at the lake, a suicide attempt by the child, she claims, and his public fit at the Duchess of Richmond's ball. It is the opinion of the medical board that the child is a danger to himself and requires immediate institutionalization for his own safety." "That is a lie." Clara stepped forward, placing herself between them and the stairs leading to the nursery. "The Duke will burn Carlisle to the ground if you touch his son." "The Duke is not here," Honoria smiled, a predator baring its teeth. "And by the time he returns, Arthur will be safely settled at Dr. Thorne's sanatorium in the Highlands. Sebastian will thank me in time. He is too soft to do what needs to be done. A mute, crippled boy is a drain on the lineage. He needs to be managed." "Seize the boy," Honoria commanded the two thugs. "No!" Clara screamed. She didn't think. Instinct, raw and primal, took over. She turned and bolted up the stairs, hiking her skirts high. "Get her!" Honoria shrieked. Clara heard the heavy boots of the men pounding on the marble behind her. She reached the landing and sprinted toward the west wing. She needed a defensible position. The nursery had a lock, but it was flimsy. She needed something stronger. She burst into the nursery. Arthur was sitting on the rug, building a tower of blocks. He looked up, smiling when he saw her, but the smile vanished when he saw the terror on her face. "Arthur, come to me!" Clara gasped. She didn't wait for him to stand. She scooped him up, his weight heavy in her arms, and ran through the connecting door that led to the old tower, the oldest part of the castle, built for defense against border rivers centuries ago. "Clara," Arthur whimpered, clinging to her neck. "Quiet, my love. We are playing a game of knights," she lied breathlessly. She reached the heavy oak door of the tower room. It was a storage room now, filled with old hunting gear and discarded furniture. She threw them inside and slammed the door shut, throwing the heavy iron bolt just as a body slammed against the wood from the other side. The door shuddered, dust raining down from the frame, but it held. "Open the door, Miss Hallowell!" Dr. Thorne's voice came through the wood, muffled but distinct. "You are interfering with a medical transfer. This is a criminal offence." Clara ignored him. She set Arthur down in the corner, behind a stack of old trunks. "Stay here," she commanded, her voice trembling but fierce. "Cover your ears." She scanned the room frantically. It was freezing. The windows were mere arrow slits, letting in the biting wind. Her eyes landed on the gun rack on the far wall. Most of the weapons had been moved to the main armory, but there was one left, an old double-barreled fowling piece used for grouse hunting. She grabbed it. It was heavy, smelling of oil and rust. She broke the breech. It was empty. "Damn," she whispered, a word no lady should know. She frantically searched the drawers of the cabinet beneath the rack. Paper cartridges, powder, shot. She had watched her father load guns 100 times before he lost his estate, but she had never done it herself. Her hands were shaking violently. Thud! The door groaned. They were using their shoulders now. "Break it down!" Honoria's voice screeched from the hallway. "Drag them out!" Clara forced her hands to steady. Powder, wad, shot, wad, ram. She repeated the mantra, spilling black powder on the floor, but managing to load both barrels. She snapped the breech closed and pulled back the hammers. Click, click. The sound was loud in the small room. She dragged a heavy oak wardrobe across the floor, her boots slipping on the dust. It screamed against the stone, but she managed to wedge it against the door. It wouldn't hold them forever, but it would buy time. "I am armed," Clara shouted at the door. "I have a shotgun and I will fire if you enter." Silence on the other side, then laughter. "Don't be absurd," Honoria called out. "She is a governess. She wouldn't know which end to hold. Break it down." The pounding resumed, rhythmic and violent. The wood around the hinges began to splinter. Clara retreated to the corner, placing herself in front of Arthur. The boy was curled into a ball, his hands over his ears, rocking back and forth. He wasn't crying anymore. He had gone into that deep, dark place inside himself where the world couldn't hurt him. "I won't let them take you," Clara whispered to him, raising the heavy gun to her shoulder. The metal was cold against her cheek. "I promise, Arthur. I won't let them take you." Time stretched and warped. Every blow to the door felt like a physical strike against her own body. The wardrobe inched back with every impact. A crack appeared in the upper panel of the door. She could see the sleeve of a rough coat through the splintered wood. "We're through," one of the men grunted. Clara leveled the barrel at the gap. "Stand back," she screamed. She didn't want to kill, but she knew what sanatoriums did to children like Arthur. They chained them to beds. They used ice baths and electric shocks. They broke their spirits until there was nothing left but a shell. She would rather die than let that happen to the boy who had called her mother. The wardrobe toppled over with a deafening crash. The door flew open, hanging off one hinge. The two hired men stepped over the debris, sneering. Behind them, Dr. Thorne adjusted his spectacles. "Put the toy away, girl," the first man growled, stepping forward. "Before you hurt yourself." Clara didn't blink. She squeezed the trigger. Boom! The sound was thunderous in the confined space. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, bruising the bone. The shot went high. She had aimed high on purpose and blew a hole in the stone archway directly above the man's head, showering him with dust and granite chips. The man scrambled back, falling over his own feet. The smell of sulfur filled the room. "The next one is for your kneecaps," Clara said. Her voice was unrecognizable, low, feral, stripped of all civility. She leveled the second barrel. "Get out!" The men hesitated. They were hired bullies, not soldiers. They hadn't signed up to be shot by a deranged woman in a velvet dress. "Seize her, you idiots!" Honoria screamed from the safety of the corridor. "She only has one shot left." "It only takes one shot to kill a man, my lady," Clara shouted back. "Who wants to be the volunteer?" For a moment, it was a stalemate. The cold wind howled through the arrow slits. Arthur whimpered behind her. Clara's arms were burning, the heavy gun wavering slightly. She knew she couldn't hold them off forever, if they rushed her all at once. And then, a sound cut through the noise of the wind. It was the baying of hounds, and beneath it, the thunder of hooves on cobblestones, so fast and furious it sounded like the apocalypse approaching. "What is that?" Dr. Thorne asked, looking toward the window. Doors downstairs slammed open with such force that the vibration was felt in the tower. A voice roared from the entrance hall, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage that made the very stones of Wycliffe Hall tremble. "Where are they?" Sebastian. He had returned. He must have met a messenger on the road, or perhaps the connection that tethered him to his son had simply pulled him back. The thugs in the doorway exchanged a terrified glance. They knew that voice. Everyone in Cumberland knew that voice. Footsteps thundered up the stairs, taking them two at a time. There was a scuffle in the corridor, a sickening crunch of bone meeting bone, and a scream that sounded like Dr. Thorne. Then, Sebastian appeared in the doorway. He was a vision of nightmares. He was covered in coal dust from the mines, his face streaked with black soot, his eyes glowing like blue demons in the dark. He held a riding crop in one hand, but his knuckles were bloody. He looked at the broken door. He looked at the thugs cowering against the wall. He looked at Clara, standing in the corner with the smoking gun, shielding his son. "Your Grace," the first thug stammered, raising his hands. "We were just following orders. Lady Honoria." Sebastian didn't speak. He moved. He grabbed the man by the collar of his coat and physically threw him across the corridor. The man hit the opposite wall and slid down unconscious. The second thug didn't wait. He bolted past the Duke, scrambling for his life. Sebastian turned to Dr. Thorne, who was pressing a handkerchief to a bloody nose. "You," Sebastian said. The word was a death sentence. "I have a writ," Thorne squeaked, waving the paper. "This child is a menace. The law says—" Sebastian snatched the paper from his hand. He didn't read it. He crumpled it in his fist and tossed it aside. "I am the Duke of Wycliffe. In this county, I am the law." He advanced on Thorne, backing the doctor until he hit the stone wall. "If I ever see your face in Cumberland again," Sebastian whispered, leaning down, "I will feed you to my hounds. Do you understand?" Thorne nodded frantically, then scurried away like a rat, leaving his medical bag behind. Only Honoria remained. She stood in the hallway, pale as a sheet, clutching her furs. Her power had evaporated. Without her legal shield and her muscle, she was just a bitter old woman facing a storm she had foolishly tried to control. "Sebastian," she tried, her voice wavering. "I was only thinking of the family name. That woman, she had a gun. She is dangerous." "Get out," Sebastian said. He didn't shout. He didn't look at her. He looked at Clara. "This is my brother's house," Honoria cried. "I have rights." "You have nothing," Sebastian roared, spinning on her. "You are no longer welcome here. You are no longer family. You tried to steal my son. You sent armed men into my nursery. If you are not off my land in 10 minutes, I will have you arrested for kidnapping and attempted murder. Go." He reached for the bell pull beside the door and yanked it once, hard enough to make the brass rattle. "Send for the constable," he said when a servant appeared, white-faced and trembling. "And for the steward. I want statements taken tonight, a magistrate by morning." Honoria looked at his face and saw the truth of it. She had overplayed her hand. She turned and fled, her footsteps echoing hollowly down the corridor, the last of the poison draining from Wycliffe Hall. Sebastian stood alone in the wreckage of the doorway. His chest was heaving. He took a ragged breath, trying to leash the violence that was coursing through his blood. He stepped into the room. "Clara?" he asked softly. Clara lowered the gun. Her adrenaline crashed all at once. Her knees gave way. Sebastian caught the gun before it hit the floor, tossing it aside, and caught her in his arms. She was shaking violently. "I didn't let them take him." She sobbed into his coal-dusted coat. "I barricaded the door. I shot the ceiling. I didn't let them take him." "I know," Sebastian murmured, crushing her against him. "I know. You did well. God, Clara, you did well." He looked over her shoulder. Arthur was still huddled in the corner. Sebastian released Clara gently, though he kept one arm around her waist to support her, and knelt down. "Arthur!" The boy looked up. He saw his father, dirty, terrifying, and safe. He crawled out from behind the trunks and launched himself at them. Sebastian caught him, burying his face in the boy's hair. "It's over," Sebastian promised, his voice thick with tears. "They are gone. No one is ever coming into this house again." Clara looked down at her hands. They were bleeding. In her frenzy to move the wardrobe, she had torn the skin on her palms and fingers. The blood was mixing with the soot on Sebastian's coat. "Your hands," Sebastian noticed, taking them gently in his own large, rough hands. He turned her palms up, inspecting the raw cuts with a tenderness that belied the violence he had just dispensed. "It's nothing," Clara whispered. "Just splinters." "It is not nothing," Sebastian said. He looked at her, his blue eyes searching her face, stripping away the layers of governess, lady, and warrior, until he saw just the woman beneath. "You fought for him. You held the line." "He is my charge," Clara said, falling back on the old defense. "He is your son," Sebastian corrected her. "In every way that matters, He is yours. You claimed him in the lake, you claimed him in the ballroom, and you claimed him today with a shotgun in your hands. He kissed her bloody palms, one after the other. It was a gesture of reverence. Come, he said, lifting Arthur into one arm and wrapping the other around Clara's shoulders. Let us get out of this cold tower. Let us go to the fire. I need to clean these wounds. They walked out of the west wing together, stepping over the debris of the door. The wind still howled outside, but the fortress was secure. The threats had been neutralized, not by legal writs or social standing, but by the ferocity of a love that refused to yield. As they descended the stairs, Mrs. Grapes and the other servants were waiting in the hall, looking terrified and ashamed that they had been unable to stop the intrusion. Hot water, Sebastian ordered, his voice weary but calm, and bandages, and bring supper to the library. We will not be dining in the formal hall tonight. Yes, Your Grace, Mrs. Grapes curtsied, tears in her eyes. Sebastian led them into the library, the heart of the house. He set Arthur down on the velvet sofa and pulled a blanket over him. Then he turned to Clara. He led her to the chair by the fire and knelt at her feet, taking a bowl of water and a cloth to wash the blood from her hands. The silence was intimate, heavy with the things that had not yet been said, but were shouted in every glance, every touch. The siege was over, but the surrender, the sweet, inevitable surrender of their hearts, was just beginning. The fire in the library hearth had burned down to glowing embers, casting a deep, pulsating orange light across the room. Outside, the wind had finally died down, leaving Wycliffe Hall wrapped in the profound, suffocating silence of deep winter. But inside, the air was thick with the scent of antiseptic, beeswax, and the lingering, metallic tang of fear that was slowly dissipating. Sebastian knelt on the Persian rug, a position of supplication that no one in England would have believed the Duke of Wycliffe capable of assuming. On the low table beside him sat a basin of warm water, now tinged pink with the blood from Clara's hands. He held her left hand in his large, rough fingers moving with a delicacy that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. "This one is deep," he murmured, his voice roughened by exhaustion. He dipped a cloth into the water and pressed it gently against a jagged cut across her palm. Clara hissed through her teeth, the sting sharp and immediate. "I am sorry," Sebastian said, his eyes snapping up to meet hers. The blue was no longer icy. It was a turbulent ocean of regret and tenderness. "I would take the pain for you if I could. It is only a scratch, Sebastian," Clara whispered, using his name without the shield of titles. It felt natural now, inevitable. The wardrobe was heavy. I didn't feel it at the time. "You didn't feel it because you were fighting for my son's life," Sebastian corrected her. He dried her hand carefully and began to wrap it in clean white linen. "You were fighting a battle I should have been there to fight. I left you defenseless." "You were saving the miners," Clara said firmly. "You did your duty, and I did mine." "Duty?" Sebastian tied off the bandage and sat back on his heels, resting his hands on his knees. He looked at Arthur, who was asleep on the velvet sofa, covered in a heavy fur throw. The boy's face was peaceful, the terror of the afternoon smoothed away by exhaustion. "Is that what you call it? Duty? A governess has a duty to teach arithmetic and manners. A governess does not barricade herself in a freezing tower and threaten armed men with a shotgun." He turned his gaze back to Clara. "That is not duty, Clara. That is love. And it is a love I have done nothing to deserve." Clara looked at her bandaged hands, then at the man kneeling before her. The coal dust was still streaked across his cheekbones, marking him like a warrior returned from the front lines. He looked stripped raw, his aristocratic armor shattered by the realization of how close he had come to losing everything. "You are wrong," Clara said softly. "You deserve it. You came back. You roared like a lion and threw them out. You are his father, Sebastian. You saved us. I was late," he said bitterly. "I am always late. I was late to see his pain with the boot. I was late to see he wasn't mad. And today, if you had not been here, He trailed off, the thought too dark to vocalize. He stood up, the movement restless, and walked to the window, staring out at the snow-covered courtyard where the moon was breaking through the clouds. "Do you know," he began, his back to her, "that day at the lake, when he called you mother?" Clara stiffened. "I told you." He was confused. It was the shock. "No," Sebastian interrupted. He was not confused. He was clear. "And when I heard it, when I heard my mute son give that title to a stranger, I felt a rage so black, I thought it would consume me." Clara swallowed hard. "I never meant to usurp your wife's place. It wasn't loyalty to my wife." Sebastian turned around. "My wife hated him. She hated his leg. She hated his silence. She looked at him and saw a failure." "No, Clara, I wasn't angry because you were taking her place. I was angry because I was jealous." The confession hung in the air, stark and honest. "I was jealous," Sebastian repeated, walking slowly back toward her. "Because in 2 weeks, you had done what I had failed to do in 4 years. You saw him, you loved him, and he loved you back. I looked at you holding him in the water, and I realized that I was a stranger to my own son, and you were his home." He stopped in front of her chair. He reached out and touched her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "I thought I needed a governess to fix him," he whispered. "But I was the one who was broken, and you fixed us both." Clara leaned into his touch, her eyes closing. Tears leaked out, hot and fast. "I didn't fix you, Sebastian. You were just lost in the dark. I only lit a candle." "Then don't let it go out," he pleaded. "Stay. Not as a governess, not as a guest." He took her bandaged hands in his, lifting them to his lips. He kissed the linen, a vow sealed in blood and medicine. "Marry me, Clara." Her eyes flew open. "Sebastian, marry me," he said again, stronger this time. "Not for Arthur, not for convenience, not to stop the gossip. Marry me because when I rode into that courtyard today and saw the door broken, my heart stopped beating. Marry me because I cannot imagine waking up in a house where you do not exist. Marry me because I love you." The words were simple, devoid of the flowery poetry of the ballroom, but they carried the weight of the mountains that surrounded them. Clara looked at him, this powerful, complicated, wounded man who had given her his coat, his trust, and now his heart. She thought of the loneliness of the last 3 years, the grey dresses, the invisible life, and then she looked at the boy sleeping on the sofa, the son of her heart. "I have no dowry," she whispered, a last weak protest of the old world. "I have only a name that was disgraced." "You have my heart," Sebastian said, "and you have the soul of a queen. That is all the dowry Wycliffe requires." He pulled her up from the chair. He didn't care about the soot on his clothes or the bandages on her hands. He kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It was desperate. A claiming of life in the face of death. A fire that burned away the last of the winter chill. "Yes," Clara breathed against his lips. "Yes, I will marry you." Noi. The wedding was small. It took place 3 weeks later in the private chapel of Wycliffe Hall on Christmas Eve. There were no hundreds of guests, no sneering lords or gossiping ladies. There was only the vicar, Mrs. Grapes, who wept openly into her handkerchief, and the staff. Clara did not wear white. She wore the emerald velvet gown, the armour she had worn to conquer London, now the dress of a bride. Around her neck, the Wycliffe emeralds glittered, no longer a costume, but a birthright. But the most important guest stood beside the Duke. Arthur, dressed in a new suit of velvet, stood tall. He held the rings on a velvet pillow. He didn't fidget. He didn't look down. When the vicar asked for the ring, Arthur stepped forward. He looked at Clara, his dark eyes shining with a light that had been absent for so long. He handed the ring to his father, and then, in the quiet of the chapel, he tugged on Clara's sleeve. She bent down. "You stay?" Arthur whispered. It was a question he had asked with his eyes 1,000 times, but now he gave it voice. "Forever," Clara promised, kissing his forehead. "I am not going anywhere." Sebastian slipped the gold band onto her finger, over the healing scars on her palm. "With this ring," he said, his voice shaking with emotion, "I thee wed, and with my body, I thee worship." As they walked out of the chapel and into the snowy courtyard, the bells of the village church began to ring in the distance, pealing out across the valley. The winter was still deep, but inside the walls of Wycliffe Hall, the spring had finally arrived. 1 year later, Christmas, 1824, the library was no longer a place of silence. It was chaotic, messy, and filled with the warmth of a roaring fire and the smell of pine and roasted chestnuts. Sebastian sat in his armchair, a book open on his lap, but he wasn't reading. He was watching the floor. "No, Papa. The bridge goes here." Arthur, now 7, was directing the construction of a massive wooden fortress. He moved with a distinct limp. The clubfoot would never be fully cured. But the heavy, painful iron boot was gone, replaced by a sleek, custom-made leather brace that allowed him to run. And he did run. He ran through the corridors. He climbed the trees in the orchard, and he chased the dogs in the yard. "My apologies, General," Sebastian laughed, moving the wooden block to the designated spot. "I am but a humble soldier in your army. Mama says soldiers have to listen," Arthur stated with the absolute authority of a child who knows he is loved. "Mama is always right," Sebastian agreed. Clara entered the room, carrying a tray of hot chocolate. She paused in the doorway watching them. She was fuller in figure now, her hand resting unconsciously on the swell of her stomach, where the next Vance heir, or heiress, was growing, due in the spring. She wore a dress of deep blue wool, bright and cheerful. Her hair was loose, framing a face that had lost the gaunt shadows of the past. "Who is always right?" Clara asked, smiling. "You are," Sebastian and Arthur said in unison. Arthur scrambled up from the floor, abandoning his fortress. He ran to her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "Papa broke the bridge." "He is a destroyer of worlds," Clara teased, setting the tray down and ruffling Arthur's hair. "But we shall rebuild it." Sebastian stood up and walked over to them. He wrapped his arms around both of them, his large hands resting over Clara's on Arthur's shoulders, pulling them into a tight circle of warmth. "Happy Christmas, Clara," he murmured into her hair. "Happy Christmas, Sebastian," she replied, leaning back against him. She looked around the room. The shadows were gone. The ghosts of the past, the cruel aunt, the gambling father, the bitter first wife, had been exorcised not by magic, but by the steady, quiet work of love. They had been healed by patience, by courage, and by the refusal to give up on each other. Arthur broke away from the hug and grabbed a wooden soldier. "Look!" he shouted, holding it up to the light. "He stands up. He doesn't fall. He stands because he has support," Sebastian said softly, looking at his wife. "Just like us." The snow began to fall outside again, covering the world in white. But inside Wycliffe Hall the fire burned bright, and the sound of a child's laughter rose up into the rafters. A song of redemption that would never be silenced again. We often believe that our scars are ugly things, evidence of our pain and our failures. But as Clara and Sebastian discovered, scars are merely the map of where we have been and what we have survived. They are the cracks where the light gets in. True love does not ask for perfection. It does not demand a flawless past or a body without pain. True love sees the broken pieces and says, "I will help you build something new." It is the hand that cleans the wound, the voice that speaks into the silence, and the courage to stand against the world for the sake of another. Clara saved Arthur not because she was a duchess, but because she was a mother in her heart long before she wore the ring. And Sebastian found his redemption not in his title, but in the humility to admit he needed help. May this story remind you that no winter lasts forever, and that even the coldest house can be warmed by the presence of a love that refuses to be afraid of the dark. With deepest appreciation for sharing this journey with us, Legends of the Fall team, thank you so much for staying with us until the end. We hope Clara, Sebastian, and little Arthur's story reminded you that family is more than blood. It is a choice we make to protect and cherish one another. If this story touched your soul, please subscribe, like, comment, and share it with your loved ones. Your support motivates us to keep telling more stories full of love, redemption, and emotional twists. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another powerful story from our channel. Click it and let yourself be surprised by even more unforgettable emotions with love. The Legends of the Fall Team.